Life's good.
Hey, it's Diane, Key, and LG, and this is episode 54 of the Now What podcast. Today's episode is going to recount the crucial moments in the final days of the Darren Chauvin trial. We will daringly ask the question, is there a crack in the blue wall of silence? And break down the importance of police telling on the police. We're going to offer some hot and unique takes on the sentencing phase and have a heart-to-heart chat about where we go from here. Today's episode is going to inform and get you caught up on all the important details surrounding the case and how the jury arrived at a guilty verdict. If you're down for the show and support what we do, follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find all of our social media handles in our show notes. Now let's get on to the show.
Hey there, Shep. It is extremely rare for a police chief to testify against their own officer.
You're familiar with the term positional asphyxia?
I am.
Is that one of the dangers of leaving somebody in a prone, handcuffed position for too long?
Yes, if they're prone to handcuffed and there's pressure around their airways or on their back, the risk and potential for them and us killing them goes up substantially.
LG, we have witnessed history in the making. The conclusion or the nail in the coffin for that verdict was the police telling on the police, in my opinion. Can you share a little bit about your perspective on that and what role that you felt it played in the conviction?
Yeah, from the beginning, I've always saw this case as bigger than Chauvin, and really as a trial about police accountability. We saw, the first week the prosecution called mostly the bystanders to testify. And then in weeks 2 and 3 of the trial, we saw the prosecutors call the men and women in blue to testify. An interesting note here is the prosecution called a total of 38 witnesses, and of which 16 were either active or former police officers. That's 42% of the prosecution's witnesses. So police telling on police was a key piece of the prosecution's strategy, in my opinion. And I believe this was by design by the head attorney general, Keith Ellison, by assembling that team and making the police, if you will, testify against the police, a key piece of the trial. As far as the role that the testimony played in convicting Chauvin, we saw officers from various roles and tenure testify, from the police chief to training officers, Chauvin's supervisory officers, and even the Jenna Scurry, the dispatch officer, and, whose testimony I found especially compelling as she was the first one to actually call the police on the police and then later became a witness who testified against the police. And so while for me, it was about the video evidence that made the case, I even watched some of that evidence without sound to really focus on the body language of what was happening. That's just my psychology hat coming on. But I suspect without the testimony of police, we probably would not have seen a conviction. Video has been available in many other cases where Black and brown people have lost their lives in senseless murders at the hands of police. And so I think one of the big differences here is the police testimony. So, Diane, this case is under a lot of spotlight. And now we have the first part of justice, a conviction. How do you feel the judge handled the case and the proceedings with all the cameras and all the political issues that we saw and even a death of a young Black man during the trial? How do you think that the judge handled the proceedings?
Look, I think that the judge was maybe annoying to me at some times, and obviously he had an extreme amount of pressure. He knew the entire world was watching, and he wanted to make sure that it was clear to everybody, including the courtroom, that he was going to run a tight ship. You've seen instances of this throughout the entire trial. In one, the attorney for the prosecution didn't refer to Officer Chauvin as Mr., and he stopped him and made him restate and referred to him as Mr. Chauvin. So that was one moment where I felt like, there was several others, but he clearly wanted to send a message. Now, when it comes to what really irritated me or I felt annoying, and I feel like I have to call this out, is because at the end of the trial, he personally, because I don't think this is within anything to do, this is his personal comment, scolded Maxine Waters for her comments on the protest that needed to occur. What you see in that, if you go back and you look at his commentary and you look at his response, you see the body language and the tone of his voice change as he began to speak more off cusp on how he felt about the situation. For me, of course, I'm a woman and a woman of color, and I will tell you that this is exactly what women are fighting against when it comes to equality. And so I would even just say, would he have had that same response? Would he have had those same comments direct if it was a man that made, those if it was a man that made that statement? And then I question it even another step to say, would he have made the same comments if it was a white man or a Republican?
Yeah, Diane, unfortunately, I don't agree with a lot of what you said there, but one thing I will say as it relates to the judge is I think he ensured that this case was not about the actions of George Floyd that day and more about the actions of Chauvin or the lack of action that day that resulted in George Floyd's death. And so while there's some things and comments maybe he made during the trial, I think overall he gave Chauvin a fair trial and set the bar very high to ensure that the defense has a difficult time in the appeals process. So, Key, speaking of the defense, what do you think was the defense's strategy and why did it fail?
Darren Chauvin's defense attorney played this clip for James Ryerson, the special agent leading the investigation into George Floyd's death.
Listen to Mr. Floyd's voice. Did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
Did it appear that Mr. Floyd said, "I ate too many drugs"?
Yes, it did.
The prosecution quickly followed up, playing more of the video and re-asking Ryerson what he heard.
I believe so. I found a pipe. Get out of the car.
Having heard it in context, you're able to tell what Mr. Floyd is saying there?
Yes, I believe Mr. Floyd was saying, "I ain't doing no drugs."
As far as the defense goes, like we said before, the defense's strategy is super simple. And that is one strategy, and that is to make you doubt that Darren Chauvin is the chief person responsible for George Floyd's death that day. Okay. That is their number one goal. The defense wanted to show you about George Floyd's lifestyle. That's why we heard about George Floyd's physical fitness. They wanted to make you believe that George Floyd could have potentially killed himself during the interaction with police. We heard where they spoke about, where they said that George Floyd said that he took too many drugs. That was a part of their strategy, right? Of course, that was inaudible for a lot of us, but that was introduced. But again, this is a classic strategy that is used by most police defense attorneys, right? In the closing arguments, I found it interesting that the defense focused on the three types of standards of evidence, which is, of course, what we're looking at in this case is beyond a reasonable doubt. But the defense, they took the time to explain preponderance of the evidence and clear and convincing evidence, which are two other standards not used in this trial. But he wanted to just, again, remind the jury how tough this standard of beyond a reasonable doubt was, because he wanted to let you know that with all these additional stories, all of these things, it wasn't Darren Chauvin killing George Floyd. It was the totality of all of these actions together that led to this unfortunate event. Also, like you said, we heard from multiple police officers who were saying that this was an excessive use of force, right? That this was not necessary. This was overkill, literally, right? And I don't feel that the defense did a great job of rebuffing that or cross-examining those officers and those witnesses. And so again, because the defense did not address the technicalities that the prosecution introduced, and because the eye test, the jury got to see the video, Darren Chauvin is going to jail.
And the Darren Chauvin trial has just told the judge that they have reached a verdict. We're expecting to hear that verdict read between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Eastern time this afternoon.
And because Darren Chauvin is, going to jail, right? I think we owe a lot of that to the police testimony, which leads us to, the question, right? Is there a crack in the blue wall of silence? Diane, LG, which one of y'all wants to tackle this? I think that is a good question. Is there a true crack in this blue wall of silence, and will we see, police, step up and testify more in the future?
Yeah, Key, I think only time and experience will tell. I do agree that with this case, there was a crack in the blue wall of silence. The question is this a crack that can be sealed with Flex Seal from OxyClean, or will this crack lead to the wall crumbling? And when I say wall, I mean the wall on holding police accountable for their actions. So, while that was a promising sign, not only does, the public need to hold police accountable, the police need to hold each other accountable. And in my opinion, at a higher level of accountability. And unfortunately, there will be a test to see what role police play in a trial when we talk about the death of Dante Wright. So I think we'll get to see here coming up, Key, on if police are willing to hold police accountable for their actions. In the case of Dante Wright, a supposed 25-year veteran of the police, I think that bar of accountability should be very high.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, I think I agree with you, 1,000%, man. I don't know if this is the watershed moment we want it to be. I think this is the case where we actually had a lot of things in our favor. And like I said, because of the eye test, it was tough to not convict someone of murder after kneeling on the neck of a person for, more than 9 minutes, right? So I agree with you, man. We'll see. I think there will be other tests in the future to really see where we are with this blue wall of silence. The George Floyd case, I think it was a pretty low barrier in my mind. But like you said, with the Dante Wright, I think that, is America really, really ready to hold police accountable for killing our citizens? We're about to find out.
I feel relieved today that I finally have the opportunity for hopefully getting some sleep. A lot of days that I prayed and I hoped and I was speaking everything into existence. I said, I have faith that he will be convicted.
Let's talk about justice now, we know the verdict. We're now in the sentencing stage of the Chauvin trial. Is your opinion that a guilty verdict is enough to say justice and accountability has been served, or we won the day? Or do we need to wait until the sentencing phase is over?
Right. I think we're seeing the beginning steps of accountability, LG. Definitely, before we can even get to a sentencing phase, you have to have that conviction, which is crucial. And that's the toughest part, I feel, with this entire situation. We saw, 3 to 4 weeks of a trial. We saw multiple witnesses. We saw the prosecution. We saw the defense. We saw the judge. All of those things culminated in Darren Chauvin being found guilty on all 3 charges, right? And so I think I'll say real quick that he was found guilty of second-degree involuntary manslaughter, which carries a maximum sentencing of 40 years, third-degree murder, 25 years, and second-degree manslaughter is 10 years, right? So this is what I'm going to say. I think he'll probably get a sentence from around maybe 15 to 20 years. You know, he is a police officer. He's probably has a clean, quote unquote, criminal history. And I think those things will be mitigating factors for Darren Chauvin. I think we still have a system that we are up against, and this system creates different sentencing guidelines for different classes of citizens, and that is the truth. I think here we'll see another test. We'll see if Darren Chauvin gets more than the 20 years. I'll be surprised. But even if he gets that maximum of the 20 years that I'm thinking about, he'll probably end up serving about 2/3 of that.
Now what is dedicated to topics and issues impacting the Black and Brown community. To elevate and empower our people, our voices, and our culture, we hope today's episode inspired you to have a Now What moment. Thanks for listening, and remember, if you want to support what we do, then share, subscribe, and listen to us at nowwhatradio.com. And until next time, stay inspired.